This video will provide an overview of how to develop a strategy to approach the biology and biochemical foundations of living systems section of the MCAT. So to begin, the biochem section is the foundations of living systems. When they say living systems, they don't just mean the human body. They also mean bacteria, archaea, anything that can reproduce on its own is considered a living system. To some extent, this includes viruses, but only as far as viruses impact living systems. So if a virus infects a bacteria or if a virus infects a human, viruses can get tied into this, but this is about more than just how the human body works. That's going to cover, on average, 25% of biochemistry. It's going to be about 65% of intro bio, 5% gen chem, 5% ochem, and it's going to be separated into the foundational concepts. If you want a better understanding of how the foundational concepts apply for the biological and biochemical foundations section, check out the video linked in the description below. Of note, these questions are not just based on how well do you know the content. So there's not going to be a question that says, what is the nucleus, or identify the nucleus here. It's going to be far more complex than that and require a lot more integration of content than explicit outright content. These questions are also going to be broken up into different types. The types are considered scientific inquiry and reasoning skills because it's testing different skills about your ability to be a scientist. There are 4 different ways. One of them is the knowledge of scientific concepts and principles. Those are the types of questions that are just explicit content-based, testing about trends on the periodic table, other pretty explicit content. Then there's going to be scientific reasoning and problem solving. So do you know how to actually create an experiment? We'll talk a little bit about that more in detail later. Also, the design and execution of research itself. So, okay, you've designed a research. Do you know how to actually execute it? How well was it executed? What could have been done better? What was done effectively? Things like that. We're actually reasoning through the research itself. And then there's also data-based and statistical reasoning. And that is the stuff that requires a calculator often. It also requires you to analyze a graph, analyze some data that's presented to you, and maybe have to do some calculation on that. But for sure, at least 2 or 3 steps are required to answer these types of questions. And they often require a lot of combination of knowledge. Now, these questions are not equally represented on each section. So let's break that down. The knowledge of scientific concepts and principles will be about 35% of the biochem section on the MCAT. And these are the questions that are content knowledge. You're going to see it maybe words, graphs, tables, diagrams, or formulas. So you're not sure exactly how that content is going to be presented to you. They could just explicitly say, okay, so nitrogen versus carbon, which is more electronegative, ready, go, just straight up words. But they could also give you some kind of a diagram, maybe of 2 different molecules, and ask you which of these molecules is able to do hydrogen bonding, which of these 2 molecules are able to do hydrogen bonding, etc. So sometimes they're really, really, really explicit. Sometimes they do still require a level of thinking about what is even said here and combining multiple things. It also requires you to recognize the scientific principles from an example, a situation, or a study. So if you have a research study that was done and they're presenting it to you, if you don't recognize, oh, they're talking about the cell structure, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to be able to answer these types of questions because they're not explicitly going to say what that scientific principle is. They're going to give you the situation and see if you recognize the principle. So again, this goes back to the whole reasoning thing. They're testing if you're going to be an effective physician, and part of being an effective physician is being an effective scientist. Then about 45% of those are going to be scientific reasoning and problem solving. This is the biggest chunk of the types of questions you're going to see. It's almost half. And this requires you drawing conclusions from pictures or diagrams, evaluating arguments about cause and effect, especially if you're given hypotheses and you're not sure if this hypothesis is going to pan out or not. You have to figure out the cause and effect based on the argument they present. It's also, okay, maybe you have to identify a bond that could form between structures. So going back to that whole, which of these are able to do hydrogen bonding, et cetera, et cetera. Finding conclusions based on that. So it's not just an explicit question. These do require a second level of thought about what's going on, specifically because it requires reasoning and problem solving in order to be able to answer these. It's not just a straight out answer. If you want more understanding, look at the SIRS video, which is also linked in the description below. Then the two lesser ones, one of them being reasoning about design execution of research. These are the questions where you're assessing how well the research was constructed or completed, all the way from formulating a hypothesis to making a conclusion. So do you know all the steps of the scientific method? Did they follow the steps of the scientific method? What did it lead them to? Could they have done it better? What were the controls? What were the independent variables? What were the dependent variables? Did they hold those true? What assumptions did they make? What inferences? And then also, based on the research findings that they made, what further research can be conducted? What further research cannot be conducted? Do you have an understanding of how to limit the scope of the research based on the findings that you found? And it's also finding the relationships between the variables. So they might not tell you which is the independent and which is the dependent explicitly or outright. And you got to figure that out for yourself. And do you see, oh, well, they have 5 different independent variables. This is not a good constructed research study. Oh, okay, they have 5 different variables that are all dependent on one another. So now we've just got a whole lot of conflated findings. I can't really say this happened because of this. So what could have been done better? What was done well? And this is also seeing how the research is going to test and extend your scientific knowledge. So there's going to be a lot of questions that may come up that are proposing alternative hypotheses to things we already have within scientific knowledge. And sometimes that is to confirm the scientific knowledge that we have, and sometimes it's challenge or test it. If you go back all the way to whatever scientists decided that the world did not spin around, the universe or the galaxy or whatever did not spin around Earth, it actually spun around the sun. It took a really long time for the rest of the world to adapt to that, despite the fact that there was actual evidence, and then he had done research and come to a conclusion. So are we going to extend scientific knowledge? Are we testing the scientific knowledge? What are we doing based on the research that has been done? And is this research even going to help extend scientific knowledge? Because was it done well or was it not done well? Then the last one that's also not that highly tested, not that popular as far as questions go, is the database statistical reasoning. These are the types of questions that require some analysis of statistics, whether that's a p-value, error bars, logs, all those kinds of things. And it also requires an analysis of a table, a chart, or a graph. So being able to recognize the axes, being able to recognize the units of measurement, all of those things come into play when analyzing and interpreting the results of data presented to you. Also understanding the significance of a p-value, a confidence interval, and error bar, other things that help with statistical significance or non-significance, being able to understand that. It's also reasoning about random systematic errors. So recognizing, okay, we'll have a p-value. That means that there's 95% likelihood that this happened because these two things are linked, but there's still 5% chance that this was completely random. And so what could be the reasons that there were random error? What could be the reasons that there was an error within my system as well? Being able to understand how statistics work, how errors can still happen, how you have a higher level of confidence, how you can increase the confidence level by altering the way the research is done in the first place. And also identifying patterns. So, okay, every single time you added this one specific independent variable, all of the results increased. So I can assume this variable leads to an increase in the outcome. Are you able to draw that conclusion based on the evidence? They might not give you that conclusion, but they'll give you the evidence and ask if you recognize the correlation between the two. So when it comes to building your own strategy, there are a lot of things that you need to be keeping in mind. First up, 35% is going to be content-based. So a lot of students, when they're not doing well in the MCAT, especially on practice tests or practice questions, they think it's a content problem. I actually don't understand how an amino acid is structured in the first place. So let me go review amino acids again. Despite the fact that I've reviewed them 15 times, maybe the 16th time is going to be the magical time. Recognizing that it's not content that is more than likely your issue, it's probably something else. 65% of those questions require reasoning. So once you have the content, you got to reason through the content to actually come to a conclusion. So memorizing, rote memorization, that might have got you through undergrad. It might have got you through all of your pre-med studies, even a post-bac, a master's, any other program that was not the MCAT or medical school, you could have got through by just understanding content. It's not about to get you through the MCAT. And that is a big shaker for students because it requires a different way to build a strategy. So applying the content is going to be far more complex. It's going to take a lot more time. Progress does not always happen quickly, especially when there's a lot of different mistakes that you could be making. So giving yourself the space and grace to mess up, to make a lot of mistakes, to have those challenges, experience those challenges, but also be so thankful for the growth that you were able to develop because of the challenges is something that doesn't come automatically for most. But when you're able to get to a space of that, it's very gratifying. So allow the time that it takes to be the time that it takes. Your patients will thank you for it on the other side. Promise. So the first question to ask yourself in figuring out your strategy is figuring out, should I focus on my strengths or my weaknesses? Define what your strengths are. These are not just, I understand biochemistry super well and I don't understand general biology at all. Like that's not really a strength or a weakness. That's just a content knowledge. But if you are able to go to the foundational concepts and you're able to say, okay, I understand foundational concepts 1A through 2C. So I really need to just focus on foundational concept 3 and 4. And then how much of those foundational concepts do I not understand? If I don't understand 3 and 4, how many questions are going to be based on 1 and 2 versus how many questions are going to be based on 3 and 4? Should I spend my time focusing in on really understanding every little detail about 1 and 2 because 1 and 2 were 75% of the questions? Or do I need to go and tackle some of that other information because foundational concept 3 actually has 60% of the content that's going to be tested in this section? Be honest with yourself about where you are. Where you are is not where you're going to end up, but it is where you are now. And you have to allow yourself to be somewhere to be able to get somewhere else. You may also recognize that the strengths that I have are actually enough. I'm stressing about the wrong things, and I really just need to be honing in on my strengths and just ignore my weaknesses. Everyone does not go to medical school to be the same type of physician. And the MCAT is testing your ability to be a broad generalization of a physician. So there are going to be things like radiology. If you never want to do radiology, you don't want to be a radiologist, there's going to be questions about NMR spectroscopy. There's going to be questions about X-ray diffractions and other things that are like high-level physics. That is far more relevant to be a radiologist. There's not about to be 59 questions about that kind of stuff. So figure out for yourself, okay, I'm actually way more interested in surgery. So I do need to understand anatomy, like in and out, up and down, through and through. That's what I'm going to focus my attention on. And then from there, that is actually going to get me to 45 questions. So I'll be straight if I get this anatomy down, especially the anatomy of the digestive system. That tends to come up so often on the MCAT. A lot of people are getting colon cancer. So there's a lot of things that are coming up more regularly on the MCAT based on how health is changing in America. Then also address your weaknesses. How many questions are testing your weaknesses? If the majority of questions are testing your weaknesses, yeah, we got to go do something about those weaknesses, but figure out which of those weaknesses are going to be easiest to address. You're not about to address every single weakness, but if you can say, oh, okay, well, I don't really understand amino acid structure at all, but I know organic chemistry, like functional groups. So I can at least identify that this would be an indole, or I can identify that 2 rings means it's probably more likely to be aromatic, which means that it's more stable under high temperatures. And then from there, understand why is it higher, stable at higher temperatures? What is the energy requirements? How does the electrons work in making a bond or breaking a bond, et cetera, et cetera. That goes back into phases. It seems like that's a real basic thought or a real basic level of content, but you can break it down into so many other different things to test if you understand how all of this goes together. Again, you may recognize, okay, well, I understand all of that, but I don't really understand electron configuration. Electron configuration comes up in a whole lot of different spaces that I have never anticipated. So that one's not necessarily going to be easy to address, but it is going to give me the most bang for my buck if I do decide to address it. The second question, are those really your strengths and weaknesses? So after you've decided, okay, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses, develop a strategy, do a practice test where you're only answering questions that are based on your strengths and you're ignoring everything else that is not your strength. Like the best people, whether that's an athlete, a physician, a singer, whatever it is, they ignore their weaknesses and just capitalize on their strengths. So figure out what your strengths are those actually your strengths? Do a practice exam. If you're below about 80% accuracy on the things that you decide are your strengths, that's not your strengths. So similar to like you, when you were younger, you might have been like, oh, well, my friend betrayed me, da, da, da. And your mom was like, yeah, but that wasn't your friend anyways. Being able to recognize like, I got to move on, I got to shift, I got to change. It's okay. Everyone's not your friend. The MCAT overall is not your friend. So don't be out here assuming that the MCAT is going to help you at all in any way. It's not. That's not what you're here for. Figure out what your strengths are. If you recognize you're below that 80% accuracy, do you want to figure out what you did that could increase that accuracy? Or are you recognizing, oh, okay, well, that's actually not my strength. I'm going to take an L on that content and I'm going to shift and learn something else. If you recognize, oh, I actually did better with my weaknesses than I anticipated, maybe you need to redefine what your strengths and weaknesses are. So maybe you do have a better understanding of electron configuration than you thought you did. And so now when you do another practice test, updating your strategy will be, okay, I'm going to answer questions that are based on electron configuration because although I don't necessarily have confidence that I know it, I'm getting these questions correct every single time. Allow yourself to not feel confident, but still be good on it. That's how you become better. And how do you need to adapt? Maybe it has nothing to do with content. Maybe it has nothing to do with your own internal preparation. Maybe it has to do with the way your mindset is working. So do you warm up before you get started every day? Biochem is the third section on the test. So did you do enough to bring yourself down from the card section and the chem phys section to actually focus on the biochem section? That is not something that's actually content, but that is a strategy that you need to adapt to be able to be ready to sit and follow through on doing this next section. Allow yourself to be open to all of the ways you might need to adapt. That also might mean you need to start having an accountability partner. Maybe you need to have somebody else talking through your challenges with you so you don't feel so alone. Third question, am I missing easy points? But beyond the content, what other things might be keeping you from getting the question correct? So are you from missing a detail in the answer choice? Are you missing a detail in the question? Are you missing a detail in the passage? Are you not looking at the note? Do you understand how these concepts actually work? Did you actually not know that definition? What are the things that are keeping you from choosing the correct answer? Do you need to slow down? Do you need to speed up? Do you need to practice your conversions without a calculator? That has nothing to do with content, but requires a whole lot more practice and just consistency to get to a space where you're more comfortable and confident being able to do those types of things. Or is it something else? Are you open to the idea that you have no idea what the issue is, but you're going to be able to identify the issue? Do you have confidence that you can figure it out? Other things that you got to keep in mind, especially when it comes to biochem section, are you reading the nucleotide sequence correctly? I know this is a mistake that I make often enough that I limit the amount of time I spend on nucleotide type of questions because there's probably always some little mistake that I'm making. And I know that I answer enough other questions correctly that little mistake isn't going to keep me away from it. If I was trying to get a better score, absolutely I need to address the fact that I'm not reading a nucleotide sequence correctly, because that is easy to address. And it's not necessarily even the nucleotide. Did I read the question that was asking about the nucleotide correctly? Did it say it was a coding or non-coding strand? Do I even know what those definitions are? So being able to recognize, like, there's a lot of different things within that I might be doing wrong that are leading to the incorrect answer. And because I've done that mistake so many times, I'm pretty frustrated that I even have those questions at all. But if I'm trying to improve, I have to take that humility pill and allow myself to say, I can do better. I'm not as good as I could be. I'm definitely not as good as I want to be when I'm leaving this earth. So there are things that I need to improve and can improve on. Are you reading the figure notes and the labels correctly? So are you actually looking at the axes? Did you miss the X? Did you mix up the X and Y axis? Are you looking at the labels? Are you looking at the units? Oh, okay, well, this was in millivolts, and then these answers are all in kilowatts. Do I understand how to convert from milli to kilo? That'll help you eliminate a lot of things really quickly just because of the unit conversions or the axis labels. Are you limiting changes to the experimental design? So sometimes you're going to get questions that are asking about you updating, extending, or doing further analysis of the research that was presented to you. Do you know how far is too far to go? Did you identify the thing that was the control? And do you recognize that you never change the control? You always change the experimental things. Do you know how to actually adapt to your research in the first place? And when it comes to sequences and steps, are you putting the steps in the correct order? Sometimes those steps will be presented in the correct order. Sometimes they won't be presented in the correct order. And then the answer will be, or the question will be asking you something about the steps in a different order than what is presented to you. So are you keeping that straight for yourself? Make sure you're taking notes and not making little mistakes there. And always avoid extremes. Unless this research has an extreme conclusion, any answer choice that is really extreme is not the correct answer. So similar to like with cars, where you're trying to match the tone of the author to any answers that you choose, same thing is going to go here. If the tone of the passage is really extreme, they're finding some landmark discovery and it has never seen before, yeah, you're going to find something extreme as an answer choice to go along with it. But if they're talking about, oh, well, we saw a 3% increase in this efficacy of blah, 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 you're not about to choose an answer choice that talks about a 75% change because they didn't see anything close to 75% change. So make sure your tone is matching the tone of the passage. The tone of your answer choices is matching the tone of the passage. And also, are you using word/phrase associations? So if you understand how the nomenclature of science works in the first place, or how words come about, so for example, if you understand that a kinase is always talking about something that's adding a phosphate group to something else, and most of the time that kinase is named after the thing that it's adding a phosphate group to. So for example, tyrosine kinase is adding a phosphate group to the amino acid tyrosine. It becomes a lot easier to actually ration your way through answer choices because you're able to say, oh, okay, those things aren't associated often. And the more that you do practice, the more that you read journal articles, the more that you do other things to immerse yourself in the scientific language, you're going to see those things associated far more regularly. If you're trying to find other ways to practice aside from doing practice questions, there's always the ability to read journal articles. I think this is a very underutilized and underestimated skill that is becoming far more and more tested and required of students who are entering medicine, because it's not something that they can really teach once you're in medical school. So some really good journal articles that will both help you test your content knowledge as well as analyzing research are stat pearls. If you're trying to understand how hypertension works and you just look up hypertension stat pearls and you read those articles, those are going to be very, very helpful for you in making sure you understand terminology and you understand things. The challenge there is to make sure that this is active and not passive. So make sure you're testing yourself. Do I actually know the definition of hypertension? Do I know what blood pressure is? Do I know what a millimeter of mercury is? What if this was presented to me in centimeters of mercury? What would the differences be here? Force yourself to make this active and not just learning to learn for learning's sake. You're trying to analyze, not just read. Similar with NCBI, any of their other articles, those ones tend to be very, very helpful. And a lot of times they're free. So the freer, the better when it comes to reading journal articles, especially if you're about to be reading a whole lot of them. I kind of suggest up to date. For most students, that is far above their level of knowledge at this point. But up to date is about to be bread and butter when you get to medical school to have a better understanding of how to treat patients and know what to do when you have patients. And up to date also tends to give you a lot of resources of other articles, especially research studies from which they got their information. So you could start with up to date, maybe not understand everything up to date itself is saying, but then you can use some of the articles linked from up to date to go help analyze research and figure out, oh, this is actually a well-constructed study, this was not a well-constructed study, et cetera, based on what you're analyzing. And going back to the word and phrase associations, test yourself on the words in context. There's a lot of times where you think you know the word, but the second that word gets put into a sentence, it completely derails what you thought that word meant. So being able to understand that word in a sentence or in a context will absolutely affirm and confirm that you know the definition. Thanks for watching.